The corridor was quiet that evening, too quiet, perhaps, for a place where life and death danced so closely together. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, casting long shadows across the pale green walls of St. Mary's Hospital. It was 7:30, and the world outside had already surrendered to darkness. Diana walked slowly through the ward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She had been here for hours, moving from bed to bed, room to room, carrying nothing but her presence and a smile that had comforted thousands. Her hands were tired from holding so many others. Her heart was full, yet somehow emptier than when she'd arrived. She had learned over the years that hospitals held a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but something deeper. A reverence. A waiting. Tonight, that silence felt heavier than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. No one noticed her at first when she entered the children's wing. That was how she preferred it. No cameras. No reporters. Just her and the people who needed someone to see them. A little boy with bandages wrapped around his arms looked up as she passed. She stopped, knelt beside his bed, and whispered something that made him smile. His mother, seated in the corner, began to cry. Diana stood and moved on. She always moved on. There were too many who needed her and never enough time. But as she turned the corner toward the next ward, something changed. The air shifted. She felt it before she saw anything. A presence, unfamiliar and yet strangely intimate. The nurses at the station looked up simultaneously, their conversations trailing off into nothing. Even the distant beeping of monitors seemed to soften. And then she appeared. A woman standing at the far end of the corridor. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back into a simple bun. She wore a long dark coat, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she stood perfectly still, as if she had been waiting there for centuries. Diana paused mid-step. Something about the woman's eyes stopped her. They weren't accusing or desperate, as so many eyes were in places like this. They were calm, knowing, and they were fixed entirely on Diana. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, separated by 20 feet of empty hallway and a lifetime of unspoken things. Diana had spent years reading people. She could tell within seconds whether someone wanted something from her, whether they were angry or grieving or simply curious. But this woman, she couldn't read her at all. And that, more than anything, made her heart begin to race. She had been coming to this hospital for nearly a decade. It had become one of her sanctuaries, a place where titles and protocols fell away, and she could simply be human among humans. She knew the staff by name. She knew which rooms held the sickest patients, which families had been camping in the waiting areas for days. Which children would light up at the sight of her and which would turn away, too frightened or too weary to accept comfort from a stranger. Tonight had been particularly difficult. There was a young mother on the 4th floor who had just been told her daughter wouldn't make it through the week. Diana had sat with her for nearly an hour, saying very little, just being present in the unbearable weight of that truth. When she'd finally stood to leave, the woman had gripped her hand and whispered, "Thank you for seeing her, for seeing us." Those words had followed Diana through every corridor since. She had learned, painfully and over many years, that compassion was not a single act, but a continuous choice. Every time she walked into a place like this, she had to choose again. To open herself to the pain of strangers, to carry their stories even when her own heart was barely holding together. Some days that choice felt impossible, but she made it anyway. Because what else was she here for if not this? Her mind drifted, as it often did in quiet moments, to the question that haunted her most. Was any of it enough? All these visits, all these hands held, all these whispered words of comfort, did they actually change anything? Or was she simply performing kindness, a temporary salve on wounds that would never truly heal? She pushed the thought away. She always did. Because even if she didn't have the answer, she knew that stopping wasn't an option. The woman at the end of the corridor still hadn't moved. Diana glanced at the nurse's station, but the staff seemed frozen, watching the scene unfold with a strange mixture of curiosity and concern. One of the younger nurses started to rise, perhaps to intercept the stranger, but the head nurse placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and shook her head. "Let it happen," that gesture seemed to say. Diana took a breath and began walking again. Her steps were measured, careful. She kept her eyes on the woman, searching for any sign of threat or instability. But there was none, only that same calm, penetrating gaze. As she drew closer, details emerged. The woman's coat was old but well kept. Her shoes were sensible, worn at the heels. There were lines around her eyes, the kind that came from years of smiling, or perhaps from years of holding back tears. Her hands, still clasped together, trembled slightly. When only a few feet separated them, Diana stopped. She didn't speak immediately. She had learned that silence often communicated more than words ever could, that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply to wait. The woman's eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She seemed to be gathering herself, choosing her words with the care of someone who knew that what came next would matter. The air between them felt charged, alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. Finally, the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I know you," she said. Diana felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, though of what she couldn't say. "I'm sorry," Diana replied gently, her training taking over. "Have we met before?" The woman smiled then, and it transformed her entire face. It was the saddest, most beautiful smile Diana had ever seen. "Not in the way you think," the woman said. "But yes, we've met." A security guard had appeared at the edge of Diana's vision, moving slowly toward them. Diana raised one hand slightly, a subtle gesture that meant, "Wait, give us a moment." He stopped. The woman noticed the exchange and nodded, as if Diana had just confirmed something she already knew. "You always did that," she murmured. "Protected those who came to you, even when you didn't know if you should." Diana's pulse quickened. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "You will," the woman said. And then she took a small step closer, closing the distance between them until Diana could smell the faint scent of lavender and something else, something that reminded her inexplicably of childhood, of gardens in summer, of her mother's hands. The woman reached out, not to touch Diana, but to gesture toward a small photograph she held in her other hand. Diana hadn't noticed it until now. The edges were worn, the colors faded. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of a house Diana didn't recognize. "Do you remember her?" the woman asked. Diana looked at the photograph, her mind racing through thousands of faces, thousands of encounters. The girl had dark hair and serious eyes. She wore a simple dress and held a stuffed rabbit under one arm. Diana started, then stopped. There was something familiar about the image, but she couldn't place it. "I'm not sure." The woman's expression didn't change. "It was 17 years ago. You were visiting a children's home in Surrey. It was your first year in the public eye, and you were terrified, though you hid it well. You spent 3 hours there, far longer than your schedule allowed." The memory came back slowly, like photographs developing in a dark room. Diana did remember that visit. She had been so young herself, barely 21, thrown into a life she hadn't been prepared for. They had told her to smile, to be brief, to move efficiently through the rooms. But when she'd seen the children, some of them sick, some simply abandoned, something in her had refused to leave. "I remember," Diana said quietly. "This girl," the woman continued, her voice beginning to crack. "She was in the corner. She didn't come forward like the others. She was too afraid. She'd been there for 2 years already, and no one had wanted her. She'd stopped hoping. Diana's throat tightened. She did remember now. A small girl, hidden partly behind a bookshelf, watching everything with those serious, ancient eyes. "You saw her," the woman said. "When everyone else had looked away, you saw her. You walked over and sat down on the floor beside her. You didn't try to make her talk. You just sat there, and after a while she showed you her rabbit. Do you remember what you told her?" Diana closed her eyes. The memory was suddenly vivid, painfully clear. She could feel the cold floor beneath her, could see the girl's small hands gripping the worn fabric of that toy. "I told her," Diana said slowly, "that the rabbit was lucky to have someone who loved him so much, and that someday someone would feel the same way about her." When she opened her eyes, the woman was crying, silent tears that traced the lines of her face and disappeared into the collar of her dark coat. "I am that girl," she whispered. The world stopped. Diana felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. She stared at the woman, truly looked at her, and suddenly saw past the silver hair and the decades. She saw the child's eyes, still serious, still watching, still hoping. "Oh my God," Diana breathed. The woman nodded. 3 months after your visit, a family came to the home. They were older, had never been able to have children of their own. They almost left without choosing anyone, but the director told them about the girl who'd met a princess, about how you'd sat with her, about the rabbit. They asked to meet me, and—" her voice broke completely. "And they took me home." Diana's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. Around them, the hospital corridor had gone completely silent. The nurses were crying. The security guard had removed his cap and was wiping his eyes. Even the lights seemed to glow softer, as if the building itself was holding space for this moment. "They gave me everything," the woman continued. "A name, Sarah, a family, love, education, a life. They died 5 years ago within months of each other. But before they did, my mother told me something. She said that the only reason they'd noticed me, the only reason they'd asked about me specifically, was because of what you did. Because you made someone like me visible." Diana reached out instinctively, and Sarah took her hand. Their fingers intertwined, 2 women connected across time by a single act of attention, of seeing. "I've wanted to tell you for so long," Sarah said. "I've wanted you to know that it mattered. That you mattered. Not because you're royal or famous, but because you stopped. Because you saw a child everyone else had overlooked, and you treated her like she was worth something." The tears were flowing freely now from both of them. Diana couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. All those doubts, all those nights when she'd wondered if any of it made a difference, they were being answered by this woman, this miracle, standing before her. Sarah leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. This was the moment she'd come for. The words she'd carried across years and miles to deliver. "Before my mother died," Sarah said, "she told me to find you if I ever had the chance. She made me promise. She said to tell you this, and these were her exact words. Tell her that she is exactly where God needs her to be. Tell her that when she feels lost, she should remember the children. Tell her that her gift isn't in her title or her position. It's in her ability to see the invisible. And that gift will echo through generations." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Diana felt something break open inside her. Not break apart, but break open, like a seed splitting to allow growth, like a door being unlocked from within. She had spent so much of her life feeling trapped, feeling inadequate, feeling like nothing she did was ever enough. And here, in this fluorescent-lit corridor, a woman she'd met for 3 minutes 17 years ago was telling her that she'd changed everything. Not through grand gestures or public speeches or carefully choreographed visits, but through one small moment of genuine attention, one instance of truly seeing another human being. "I don't know what to say," Diana finally managed. Sarah smiled through her tears. "You don't have to say anything. You just have to know. You have to carry this with you, because the world will try to convince you that you're not enough, that you're not making a difference. But you are. You're making all the difference." She released Diana's hand slowly, reverently, as if completing a ritual that had been years in the making. "I have children now," she continued. "2 daughters. I tell them about the day a princess sat on the floor with me and made me feel seen. I tell them that kindness isn't about big moments. It's about showing up. It's about paying attention. It's about treating every person as if they matter, because they do." Diana wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, but failing completely. "What are their names?" she asked. "Your daughters?" "Grace," Sarah said. "And Diana." The sound that came from Diana then was half laugh, half sob. She reached out and pulled Sarah into an embrace. They stood there, holding each other in the middle of the hospital corridor, 2 women connected by the invisible threads of compassion and consequence. Around them, life began to move again. The nurses dabbed at their eyes and returned to their stations. The security guard nodded respectfully and stepped back. But something had fundamentally changed. Everyone who had witnessed this moment felt it. A reminder that their work mattered, that their presence mattered, that the smallest acts of kindness could alter the trajectory of an entire life. If you believe that moments like this happen for a reason, take a second to like this video. It helps these stories reach more hearts. When they finally separated, Diana held Sarah at arm's length, taking her in completely. "Will you stay?" she asked. "Just for a little while? I'd like to hear more about your life." "About your family," Sarah nodded. "I'd like that very much." They walked together slowly, toward a small waiting area at the end of the hall. As they moved, Diana felt something she hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something quieter and more sustainable. It was purpose. Clear, undeniable purpose. She had spent so long questioning her path, wondering if she was making any real impact in a world that seemed determined to reduce her to headlines and controversy. But Sarah's presence, her very existence, was living proof that impact didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grew quietly in the shadows, taking years or decades to reveal itself. They sat together for nearly an hour. Sarah told her about her childhood after the adoption, about learning to trust, about eventually thriving. She spoke about her wedding day, about the birth of her daughters, about becoming a teacher, because she wanted to help children who felt invisible, the way she once had. Diana listened with the intensity of someone receiving a great gift. She asked questions. She laughed. She cried some more. And with every story Sarah shared, she felt herself being rebuilt from the inside out. Eventually, Sarah had to leave. She had a train to catch, a family waiting for her back home. They exchanged information, promised to stay in touch. As Sarah stood to go, she paused and looked at Diana one last time. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. For then, and for now." "Thank you," Diana replied. "You have no idea what you've given me tonight." But Sarah smiled in a way that suggested she knew exactly what she'd given. She'd given Diana her own reflection. Not the one in magazines or newspapers, but the real one. The one that mattered. After Sarah left, Diana remained in the waiting area for a long time. The hospital had grown even quieter. Through the windows, she could see the lights of London stretching out into the distance. Millions of lives being lived in millions of ways she would never know about. But tonight, she'd glimpsed one of those lives. And it had changed everything. She thought about all the other children she'd met over the years, all the hands she'd held, all the faces she'd looked into. She wondered how many of them carried pieces of those encounters forward. She wondered how many times she'd altered someone's trajectory without ever knowing it. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. It meant that every interaction mattered. Every moment of presence or absence left its mark. There was no such thing as a small kindness, because you never knew which act of attention would be the one that changed everything. She finally stood and made her way back through the corridors. The night shift was arriving, nurses and doctors trading places with those who'd been there all day. Diana stopped at the station where she'd first seen Sarah appear. "Are you all right?" the head nurse asked gently. Diana nodded. "Yes, I think I'm more all right than I've been in a very long time." The nurse smiled knowingly. "That woman. She was waiting for you. She'd been here for 3 hours asking about your schedule. We almost turned her away, but there was something about her. Something that made us believe she needed to see you." "She did," Diana said, "and I needed to see her." As she left the hospital that night, stepping out into the cool London air, Diana felt the weight of everything she carried shift. It didn't disappear, she knew it never would. But it redistributed itself, became more bearable somehow. She thought about Sarah's mother's words, about being exactly where she was supposed to be, about her gift for seeing the invisible, about echoes through generations. She climbed into the car that waited for her and leaned her head back against the seat. The driver asked if she was ready to go home, and she said yes. But as they pulled away from the hospital, she found herself thinking that home wasn't really a place anymore. It was this. These moments of connection, these glimpses of how one life could touch another and set off a chain reaction of love and meaning. She would return to this hospital many times in the months and years to come. She would continue her work, continue showing up, continue choosing to see people who felt invisible, but she would do it differently now. With more certainty, with deeper faith in the power of presence, because Sarah had given her a gift far greater than gratitude. She had given her evidence, proof that the work mattered. Proof that showing up and paying attention and treating people with dignity wasn't just noble or kind, it was transformative. The city lights blurred past the car windows. Diana closed her eyes and saw Sarah's face again, not as the woman she'd become, but as the little girl hiding behind a bookshelf, clutching a stuffed rabbit and trying not to hope. And she made a promise to that girl and to all the others like her. "I will keep seeing you. I will keep showing up. I will keep believing that these small moments of connection are the most important work I'll ever do." Because if one afternoon spent sitting on a cold floor could alter the entire course of a child's life, then nothing was small. Nothing was insignificant. Every act of genuine attention was a seed planted, waiting for its moment to bloom. Sometimes that moment came quickly. Sometimes it took 17 years. But it always came. The car turned toward home, and Diana felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning. The certainty that her life, for all its complications and constraints, was being spent on something that mattered. Sarah's whispered words echoed in her mind. "You are exactly where God needs you to be." And for the first time in years, Diana believed it. The mysterious woman who had appeared in the hospital corridor had delivered more than a message. She had delivered redemption, proof that compassion compounds across time, that kindness creates echoes we may never hear, but which ripple outward nonetheless, touching lives we'll never meet, in ways we'll never fully understand. And that invisible, immeasurable impact was the truest legacy anyone could leave. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Princess Diana